Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man who has been dead for over 500 years and yet somehow remains the most relentlessly quoted, the most endlessly merchandised, and the most profoundly misunderstood genius in Western history. Leonardo da Vinci. You know the name. You've seen the Mona Lisa on coffee mugs and the Vitruvian Man on t-shirts. You've heard people call him a painter, an inventor, a visionary, a prophet of technology, and all of that is true, in a way. But it is also true that Leonardo never finished most of what he started, that he left behind more abandoned projects than completed ones, that he was fired from commissions, accused of heresy, and spent years designing war machines for tyrants while privately writing in his notebooks about the cruelty of killing. If you're watching this, do me a favor, like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're from. Then dim the lights, maybe put on some quiet music, and settle in. This is going to take a while, because Leonardo da Vinci cannot be understood quickly. He refused to be understood quickly in his own lifetime, and we have no right to rush him now. Here is what I want you to consider as we begin. Perhaps Leonardo's famous inability to finish things was not a flaw at all. Perhaps completion was never the point. The point was the looking, the questioning, the relentless pursuit of understanding a universe that revealed itself only to those patient enough to watch. He didn't leave us a body of work so much as a method of being alive. Leonardo da Vinci is usually filed under Renaissance genius, a phrase so overused it has become meaningless. We imagine him as a kind of superhuman, effortlessly producing masterpieces between sessions of inventing helicopters and understanding human flight. The reality is stranger and, I think, more interesting. Leonardo was not a genius in the way we typically imagine geniuses: focused, productive, driven toward completion. He was instead the physical embodiment of a particular way of seeing, a mind that refused to accept boundaries between disciplines, between observation and imagination, between what was known and what could be discovered. He painted fewer than 20 works that survive. He filled more than 7,000 pages of notebooks with drawings, theories, and questions. He designed machines that could not be built, studied bodies that could not be healed, and imagined flight centuries before it was possible. His contemporaries called him divine. They also called him unreliable. Both assessments were accurate. What Leonardo offers us is not a collection of finished products, but a demonstration of what it means to pay attention. His notebooks are not sketchbooks in the conventional sense. They are records of a consciousness in perpetual motion, a mind that looked at flowing water and saw mathematics, that looked at bird wings and saw engineering, that looked at a human face and saw the entire history of emotion contained in the curve of a lip. He did not separate art from science because, to him, they were the same thing, different languages for describing the same universe. This is not how we are taught to think. It is not how most of us live. And that is precisely why Leonardo still matters. The bastard of Vinci. Leonardo was born on the 15th of April, 1452, in the small Tuscan hill town of Vinci, about 20 miles west of Florence. He was the illegitimate son of a 25-year-old notary named Ser Piero da Vinci and a young peasant woman named Caterina, about whom almost nothing is known. Within a year of Leonardo's birth, Ser Piero had married a woman of appropriate social standing, and Caterina had been married off to a local artisan. Leonardo was raised in his father's household, acknowledged but set apart. Illegitimacy in 15th century Italy carried real consequences. Leonardo could not inherit his father's property or business. He could not attend a university or join the guild of notaries. He was, in the language of the time, a bastard, a word that carried legal weight as well as social stigma. He would never be quite respectable, never quite an insider, never quite able to take for granted the paths available to legitimate sons of prosperous families. And yet, here is the strange alchemy of circumstance. The doors that closed to Leonardo may have opened others. Because he could not become a notary like his father, he was free to pursue what actually interested him. Because he lacked formal education in Latin and the classics, he was forced to learn by observation rather than by authority. He called himself a man without letters, and he meant it as both admission and defiance. The universities taught Aristotle and Galen and the wisdom of the ancients. Leonardo taught himself by looking at rivers and dissecting corpses and watching how birds turned in the wind. The accident of his birth excluded him from one world and pushed him into another, a world where knowledge came not from books but from the evidence of the senses. Would Leonardo have become Leonardo if he had been legitimate? If he had gone to university, learned his Latin, joined the notary guild, inherited the family business, we cannot know. But it is worth noting that the very thing that marginalized him, his exclusion from traditional paths, may have been the condition that made his particular kind of genius possible. He was, from the beginning, an outsider, and outsiders sometimes see what insiders cannot. Florence in ferment. To understand Leonardo, you must first understand Florence, in the second half of the 15th century, a city of about 60,000 people, smaller than you might imagine, but dense with ambition, money, and new ideas. This was not yet the Renaissance, as later centuries would romanticize it. It was something raw, a commercial republic run by merchant families who had grown rich on wool, banking, and trade, and who were now investing that wealth in art, architecture, and the cultivation of what they called humanitas, the study of what it means to be human. The Medici family dominated Florence without formally ruling it. Cosimo de' Medici, and later his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent, maintained their power through a careful mixture of patronage, manipulation, and genuine enthusiasm for learning and art. They funded artists, collected ancient manuscripts, established academies, and surrounded themselves with philosophers who debated Plato and Neoplatonism late into the night. Florence under the Medici was not a democracy few Renaissance cities were, but it was a place where talent could rise, where a clever young man from an obscure background could find opportunities unavailable elsewhere. The city buzzed with workshops and studios. Painters, sculptors, goldsmiths, and architects competed for commissions from churches, guilds, and wealthy patrons. Art was not yet the solitary romantic pursuit it would later become. It was a craft, a business, a collaboration. A successful workshop might employ dozens of assistants, grinding pigments, preparing panels, filling in backgrounds, while the master conceived the design and executed the most important parts. Quality was expected, innovation was rewarded, and reputation was everything. Into this environment, around 1466 or 1467, came a teenage Leonardo. His father, Ser Piero, had seen the boy's drawings and recognized something unusual. He brought samples to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most successful artists in Florence, and asked for an honest assessment. Verrocchio was impressed enough to take the boy on as an apprentice. Leonardo was approximately 15 years old. His education was about to begin. Verrocchio's workshop. Andrea del Verrocchio ran one of the finest workshops in Florence, a bottega, as the Italians called it, where art was produced the way other goods were produced, through division of labour, accumulated expertise, and the slow training of the next generation. Verrocchio himself was a goldsmith, sculptor, and painter, though he was most celebrated for his metalwork and his monumental sculptures. His workshop took on commissions for everything, from ceremonial armour to tomb monuments to altarpieces. Young apprentices learned by doing. They ground pigments, stretched canvases, prepared gesso, and gradually advanced to more complex tasks as their skills developed. Leonardo spent roughly a decade in this environment, first as an apprentice and then as an assistant, even after he qualified as a master painter in his own right. He was accepted into the Painters' Guild of Florence, the Arte dei Medici Speziali, in 1472, but he stayed on with Verrocchio for several more years. The workshop was his school, his laboratory, and his community. He learned to work in multiple media: paint, clay, bronze, silver. He learned the technical foundations of perspective, anatomy, and chiaroscuro. He learned how to collaborate, how to meet deadlines, or not meet them, as would become his habit, and how to please patrons. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal but too good not to tell, about a painting called The Baptism of Christ, a commission Verrocchio was completing around 1475. The master assigned the young Leonardo to paint one of the angels in the composition. When Verrocchio saw what Leonardo had done, the soft modelling of the face, the luminous quality of the skin, The way the figure seemed to exist in three-dimensional space, he was so impressed or so humiliated that he vowed never to paint again. The story is probably exaggerated. Verrocchio continued to paint after this, and the workshop tradition made such collaborations commonplace. But the anecdote captures something true about Leonardo's emergence. Even as a young man, he was doing something different. His angels breathed, his figures lived, his technique was already pushing beyond what his teachers could show him. What Verrocchio gave Leonardo was not just technical training, but a model for thinking. In a workshop, you solved problems. You figured out how to cast a bronze that was too large for conventional methods. You developed new techniques for gilding or enameling or painting on curved surfaces. You learned that art was not separate from engineering, that beauty required understanding of materials and forces. This pragmatic, problem-solving approach would stay with Leonardo his entire life. He never stopped being a workshop artist, even when his workshops were in the palaces of dukes and kings, the left hand of God. Open any of Leonardo's notebooks and you encounter something strange. The text runs backward, from right to left, each letter reversed as if reflected in a mirror. This is Leonardo's famous mirror writing, and it has generated centuries of speculation. Was it a code to protect his ideas from theft? A symptom of dyslexia or some other neurological difference? A deliberate eccentricity cultivated to enhance his mystique? The most prosaic explanation is probably the correct one. Leonardo was left-handed. In 15th century Italy, left-handedness was viewed with suspicion. The Latin word for left, sinister, tells you all you need to know about the cultural associations, but Leonardo seems to have written with his left hand throughout his life. For a left-handed person using a quill and ink, writing from right to left prevents the hand from smearing the wet ink. It is simply more practical. Leonardo may have adopted mirror writing as a young man and found it comfortable enough to continue. That said, the practical explanation does not exhaust the meaning. Leonardo's notebooks were private documents, written for himself rather than for publication. He occasionally wrote in conventional script when he wanted others to read his words, letters to patrons, for instance, or inscriptions meant for public display. The mirror writing marked the boundary between his public communications and his private thoughts. It was not impenetrable. Anyone with a mirror and patience could read it, but it did create a barrier, a slight resistance between Leonardo's inner world and the outside. The notebooks themselves became a kind of parallel universe. In them, Leonardo could think aloud without fear of judgment. He could pursue tangents, entertain contradictions, sketch ideas that might never lead anywhere. He could write grocery lists next to anatomical observations, design weapons alongside studies of flowering plants, ask questions he had no way of answering. The mirror writing was the entrance to this world, the visible sign that you were crossing from the ordinary into the Leonardesque. It said, "What follows is for me alone," or perhaps, "What follows is for anyone curious enough to look, the unfinished master." Leonardo's reputation for leaving things unfinished was established early and never really changed. In 1481, the monks of San Donato a Scopeto commissioned him to paint an altarpiece, the Adoration of the Magi. Leonardo worked on it for 2 years, producing an extraordinary underpainting, a swirling composition of figures and horses, filled with emotion and movement, and then abandoned it when he left Florence for Milan. The painting was never completed. It still exists in the Uffizi, a magnificent ghost of what it might have been. This pattern repeated throughout his life. The Sforza horse was never cast. The Battle of Anghiari was left half-finished and eventually destroyed. St. Jerome in the Wilderness remains unfinished. Even paintings he ostensibly completed, like the Mona Lisa, he continued to work on for years, carrying them from city to city, adding layers of glaze, refusing to let them go. His patrons complained. His rivals mocked him. Giorgio Vasari, the 16th century biographer who did more than anyone to shape Leonardo's posthumous reputation, wrote admiringly of his genius, but also noted his tendency to begin things he could not finish. Was this a character flaw? A failure of discipline? Or was it something else, a philosophy, perhaps, of what art and knowledge were for? Leonardo once wrote that, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." The line is sometimes cited as an excuse for procrastination, but I think he meant something more profound. For Leonardo, the value of a project lay not in its completion, but in what it taught him. Each painting, each sculpture, each machine was an investigation, a way of learning about light, form, movement, anatomy, emotion. Once he had learned what he needed to learn, the project had served its purpose. Whether or not it was finished in the conventional sense was almost beside the point. This is not how most people think about work, and it was not how Leonardo's patrons thought about it either. They wanted their altarpieces, their portraits, their equestrian statues. They wanted products. Leonardo was not producing products, he was producing understanding. The gap between these two orientations caused endless friction during his lifetime. It also left us with one of the most remarkable collections of unfinished work in the history of art fragments and beginnings that, in their incompleteness, reveal more about his process than any polished masterpiece could. The notebooks. Over the course of his life, Leonardo filled an estimated 20,000 pages with drawings, notes, observations, and speculations. About 7,000 of those pages survive, scattered across museums and libraries in Milan, Paris, London, Madrid, and Seattle. They constitute the largest and most detailed record we have of any Renaissance mind, a window into how one extraordinary person actually thought. The notebooks are not organized in any conventional sense. Leonardo did not write treatises or compose systematic arguments. He wrote in fragments, returning to subjects over years or decades, often contradicting himself as his understanding evolved. A single page might contain a study of water turbulence, a design for a mechanical wing, a reminder to buy candles, and a meditation on why the sky is blue. The effect is overwhelming and exhilarating. You are watching a mind in motion, following its own logic, making connections that no one else would think to make. The subjects he covered are staggering in their range: anatomy, botany, geology, optics, hydraulics, mechanics, architecture, military engineering, flight, acoustics, painting technique, urban planning, costume design, and more. He invented terms for things that had no names. He drew machines that would not be built for centuries. He asked questions that science would not begin to answer until long after his death. Why is the sky blue? How do birds fly? What makes water swirl in eddies? Where does the soul reside in the body? He was not afraid of large questions, but he always grounded them in specific observations. The particular for Leonardo was the path to the universal. Reading the notebooks today requires patience. They are written in his mirror script, often in archaic Italian. The drawings are dense and technical. The connections between entries are frequently unclear. But for anyone willing to make the effort, they offer something irreplaceable: the experience of thinking alongside one of the most capacious minds in human history. The notebooks are not just records of what Leonardo knew, they are invitations to see the way he saw, seeing as science. Leonardo believed the eye was the supreme instrument of knowledge. The eye, he wrote, encompasses the beauty of the whole world. Sight, for him, was not passive reception but active investigation. To truly see something was to understand its structure, its causes, its relationship to everything else. Looking was a form of research, and painting was a form of philosophy. This sounds abstract, but Leonardo made it concrete. His studies of light and shadow were not merely aesthetic, they were attempts to understand the physics of illumination, the way light rays travelled and scattered, the reasons some surfaces reflected while others absorbed. His anatomical drawings were not illustrations but investigations, each rendering a hypothesis about how muscles attached and bones articulated. His landscapes were not decorations but geological studies, recording the effects of erosion and the formation of rock strata. He invented, or at least perfected, the technique called sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke, in which edges are softened and blurred, transitions made imperceptible, forms emerging gradually from shadow. This was not merely a stylistic choice, it was based on his understanding of how human vision actually works. We do not see hard edges in nature. Our eyes constantly adjust, focus shifts, details emerge and recede. Leonardo's sfumato mimics this experience, creating images that feel alive because they engage our eyes the way the real world does. Saper vedere, he called it, knowing how to see. It was his great theme, the thread connecting all his disparate interests. Whether he was studying the flight of birds or the fall of drapery or the flow of blood through the heart, he was always asking the same question. What is actually happening here? Not what tradition says is happening. Not what seems obvious at first glance. What is actually happening when you look closely, patiently, without preconceptions? This is harder than it sounds. We are trained from childhood to see what we expect to see, to fit observations into pre-existing categories, to move quickly from perception to conclusion. Leonardo spent his life trying to unlearn this. He looked at things longer than anyone else. He drew the same subject from multiple angles. He questioned his own conclusions and went back to look again. The result was a body of observation that, in many cases, would not be surpassed for centuries. The anatomy of curiosity. Between 1489 and 1513, Leonardo dissected more than 30 human corpses. He did this work in the crypts and hospitals of Florence, Milan, and Rome, often at night, often alone or with a single assistant, surrounded by the smell of death and the dim light of candles. There was no refrigeration. Bodies decomposed quickly. He had to work fast, cutting open the cadavers before they became unusable, recording what he saw in drawings that remain among the most beautiful and accurate anatomical images ever made. Why did he do this? Partly for his art, understanding the body, how muscles attached to bones, how tendons pulled, how fat deposited beneath the skin made him a better painter of the human form. But his investigations went far beyond what any painter needed to know. He studied the ventricles of the heart and the valves that controlled blood flow. He mapped the nervous system. He examined the fetus in the womb. He was not illustrating, he was researching. His anatomical drawings would not be equalled, let alone surpassed, until the 19th century. He was the first to accurately depict the spine's curvature and the heart's chambers. He understood, centuries before William Harvey, that the heart was a pump. He saw things that no one else would see for generations because no one else was looking the way he was looking, with the patience to actually observe rather than simply confirm what the textbooks said. The dissections required a strong stomach. Leonardo noted that working with dead bodies was unpleasant and sometimes frightening. He warned readers that they would need to overcome their disgust if they wanted to learn what he had learned, but he never stopped. The desire to understand the machinery of the living was stronger than his revulsion at cutting into the dead. This is one of the things I find most remarkable about Leonardo, his willingness to go wherever his curiosity led him, regardless of comfort, convention, or squeamishness. The body was a mystery. He wanted to solve it. Everything else was secondary. Muscles, bones, and the architecture of motion. Leonardo looked at the human body and saw a machine, an extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily complex machine, but a machine nonetheless. His anatomical studies were biomechanical before biomechanics existed as a field. He analysed the body in terms of levers and pulleys, forces and resistances. He understood that muscles worked in antagonistic pairs, that the skeleton provided a structural framework, that movement resulted from the coordinated action of multiple systems. This was not reductionism in the diminishing sense. Leonardo did not think the body was merely a machine. He remained fascinated by the soul, by consciousness, by whatever it was that animated mere matter into life. But he recognized that understanding the physical mechanisms was a necessary first step. You could not understand how a horse ran, or a bird flew, or a man lifted his arm unless you understood the mechanical principles involved. His drawings reflect this dual vision. They are scientifically precise, accurate enough to be used in medical training, but also aesthetically powerful. Leonardo saw no conflict between these goals. A well-functioning body was a beautiful body. The elegance of the design, the economy of the structure, the integration of all the parts into a working whole, these were sources of wonder as well as objects of study. His anatomical drawings celebrate the body even as they dissect it. There is a feedback loop here between art and science that is central to Leonardo's method. His artistic training gave him the skills to render what he observed with unprecedented accuracy. His scientific investigations gave him new things to observe, new structures to understand. The scalpel and the brush were tools for the same project, knowing the world through close attention to its particulars. Neither discipline made sense without the other. Together, they made possible a kind of knowledge that neither could achieve alone: the impossible machines. Leonardo designed flying machines, diving suits, armored tanks, self-propelled vehicles, bridges, canals, automated looms, machine guns, and dozens of other inventions. Most of them could not have been built with the materials and power sources available in his time. Does this make him a failed engineer, or something more interesting, a man designing for a future he could imagine but not inhabit? His flying machines are the most famous examples. He studied birds obsessively, filling notebooks with observations of their flight, the shape of their wings, the way they turned and soared and dove. He concluded that human flight was possible and designed machines to achieve it: ornithopters powered by the pilot's muscles, gliders based on bat wings, something resembling a helicopter. None of them would have worked. Human muscles cannot generate enough power to sustain flight through flapping wings. The materials Leonardo had access to were too heavy. The principles of aerodynamics he was working with were incomplete. And yet, his approach was correct. He began with observation, moved to analysis, proceeded to design. He understood that the problem of flight was a problem of lift and thrust, of weight and surface area. He experimented with models. He revised his designs when they failed. The specific machines he produced were inadequate, but the method was sound. When the Wright brothers finally achieved powered flight in 1903, they were following the same approach Leonardo had pioneered 4 centuries earlier: observe, analyze, design, test, revise. There is something poignant about Leonardo's impossible machines. They represent the limit of what a single mind, however brilliant, can achieve without the accumulated knowledge of later generations. Leonardo could imagine things he could not build. He could see where technology needed to go but could not take it there himself. In this, he is not so different from all of us. We are all constrained by the tools and materials available to us, the knowledge accumulated so far, the questions our era knows how to ask. Leonardo simply pushed against those constraints harder and more creatively than almost anyone else. Water. Always water. No subject fascinated Leonardo more than water. He studied it for decades, filling notebooks with observations of rivers, currents, eddies, waves, floods, and erosion. He designed canals, irrigation systems, and hydraulic machines. He drew water with an accuracy and beauty that verges on obsession: spiraling vortices, cascading falls, the intricate patterns formed when a stream meets an obstacle. What was it about water that captivated him so completely? Part of the answer is practical. Renaissance Italy needed water management for agriculture, for transportation, for the fountains and gardens that wealthy patrons demanded. Leonardo worked as a hydraulic engineer for much of his career, advising on canal projects, designing locks, proposing schemes for diverting rivers. This was useful work, and it paid, but his interest went beyond utility. Water was, for Leonardo, the paradigm of constant change, always moving, always transforming, never the same from moment to moment, yet always obeying underlying laws. In water, he saw a model for understanding the universe itself, a system in perpetual flux, governed by principles that could be discovered through patient observation. His studies of fluid dynamics anticipated by centuries the work of later scientists. He understood turbulence before the mathematics existed to describe it. There is also something more personal in his water studies, something harder to articulate. Leonardo returned to water again and again, drawing it in moments of calm reflection, sketching catastrophic floods that overwhelm cities and drown populations. Water was life-giving and death-dealing, essential and terrifying. In his late drawings especially, water becomes almost apocalyptic, massive deluges consuming the world. These are not observations but visions, expressions of something dark and profound in his imagination. The man who spent his life studying the world's intricacies ended by imagining its destruction. Water was his medium for both. The Mona Lisa problem. She sits behind bulletproof glass in the Louvre, the most famous painting in the world, surrounded by tourists taking selfies. Her smile, is it a smile? Is it something else? Has launched 1,000 interpretations. The Mona Lisa is so familiar, so reproduced, so commodified that it has become almost impossible to see. Leonardo began the portrait around 1503, probably of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. He never delivered it. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, from Florence to Milan to Rome to France, continuing to work on it, adding layers of translucent glaze, refining the sfumato that gives her face its ethereal quality. When he died in 1519, it was in his studio at Amboise. He had kept it for 16 years. Why? The painting was a commission. Giocondo presumably wanted it. Leonardo could have finished it, handed it over, collected his fee. Instead, he made it his companion for nearly 2 decades, the one painting he would not let go. What was he seeking in that face, in those layers of oil and varnish? The technique itself provides a clue. Leonardo applied the paint in layers so thin they are almost invisible, building up the surface over years. The result is a skin that seems to glow from within, shadows that have no hard edges, an expression that shifts depending on where you look and how you stand. The painting is not static. It responds to the viewer. The smile appears and disappears. The eyes seem to follow you. The landscape behind her, dreamlike and geological, suggests depths beyond the figure. Perhaps this is what Leonardo could not finish, an image that truly captured how we see another person, how expression flickers across a face, how perception is never fixed but always shifting. Every layer of glaze brought him closer. No number of layers would ever arrive. The Mona Lisa is the ultimate expression of Leonardo's philosophy of knowledge, an endless approach towards something that can be approximated but never finally grasped. He kept it because it represented the impossible goal he spent his life pursuing, complete understanding of the visible world. The Last Supper, crumbling. In the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, on a wall at the far end of the room where the Dominican friars took their meals, Leonardo painted the Last Supper. It was completed around 1498. It began deteriorating almost immediately. The problem was Leonardo's experimental technique. Traditional fresco painting required speed. Pigments were applied to wet plaster and absorbed into the wall as it dried. The painter worked in sections, racing against the setting plaster, accepting that revisions were impossible once the surface cured. Leonardo, who never worked fast and always wanted to revise, found this unacceptable. Instead, he developed his own method, a combination of tempera and oil applied to a dry wall that he had prepared with layers of gesso and other materials. The results initially were spectacular. The Last Supper was more luminous, more detailed, more nuanced than any fresco could be. Leonardo could work slowly, layering paint, adjusting expressions, achieving effects impossible with traditional methods. The faces of the apostles registered shock, disbelief, grief, a cascade of individual reactions to Christ's announcement of betrayal. The composition drew the eye inevitably to the central figure. It was a masterpiece. And it was a slow-motion disaster. The experimental medium did not bond properly with the wall. Moisture seeped through from the other side. Within 20 years, the paint was flaking. Within 50, the image was almost unrecognizable. Subsequent centuries brought well-meaning restorations that often did more harm than good. Today, what we see at Santa Maria delle Grazie is a ghost, some original pigment, much overpaint, a fragmentary record of what Leonardo intended. There is something almost too apt about this. Leonardo's perfectionism, his refusal to accept the limitations of existing techniques, created a painting that was brilliant and doomed in equal measure. He wanted permanence but achieved impermanence. He wanted control but created conditions for decay. The Last Supper is magnificent and heartbreaking, a reminder that great ambition often carries great costs. The Vitruvian Man. Around 1490, Leonardo drew a naked man standing inside a circle in a square. The figure has 2 pairs of arms and 2 pairs of legs, suggesting motion, as if the same person has been captured in 2 poses superimposed. Above and below the drawing are blocks of text, written in Leonardo's mirror script, explaining the proportional relationships the figure embodies. This is the Vitruvian Man, and it has become one of the most recognizable images in Western culture. The name comes from Vitruvius, a Roman architect of the 1st century BCE whose treatise on architecture included a passage about the ideal proportions of the human body. According to Vitruvius, a well-formed man could be inscribed in both a circle, centered on the navel, and a square centered on the genitals. Leonardo was not the first artist to attempt this illustration. The idea had circulated among Renaissance artists for decades, but his version is the most elegant, the most anatomically informed, and the most beautiful. What makes the drawing more than an illustration is the worldview it encapsulates. For Leonardo and his contemporaries, the proportions of the human body were not arbitrary. They reflected the mathematical harmony of the cosmos itself. The body was a microcosm, a small-scale model of the larger universe, built on the same geometric principles that governed the heavens. To understand the body was to understand creation. To perfect the body in art was to approach the divine. Leonardo's drawing mediates between measurement and meaning. On one level, it is rigorously empirical. He measured actual bodies, compared his findings to Vitruvius, refined the proportions until they matched observation. On another level, it is a symbol, a statement about human dignity, human potential, the place of humanity in the order of things. The figure stands upright, arms extended, occupying as much space as possible. He is not humble or diminished. He is, in a sense, the measure of all things. 5 centuries later, we have put this image on currency and credit cards, on book covers and corporate logos. It has become a brand for human achievement, for science, for medicine. Leonardo might have been amused by its ubiquity. He might also have noted the irony, an image about careful measurement and deep observation, reduced to a symbol that we barely see: Milan, Ludovico, and the uses of genius. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence for Milan. He was 30 years old, restless, and seeking new opportunities. Milan was ruled by Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, not yet the Duke officially, but the de facto ruler, governing on behalf of his young nephew. Ludovico was ambitious, cultivated, and looking for talent to enhance his court's prestige. Leonardo wrote him a letter offering his services. The letter is a remarkable document. Leonardo listed his qualifications as a military engineer at length. He could design bridges, tunnels, armoured vehicles, cannons, catapults, and machines for naval warfare. Only at the end did he mention, almost as an afterthought, that he could also paint and sculpt. The emphasis was strategic. Ludovico needed engineers. Italy was perpetually at war, and Milan's position was precarious. Leonardo presented himself as what the market demanded. He would spend 17 years in Milan, the longest settled period of his life. He was listed in Ludovico's household as Pictor et Ingeniarius Ducalis, painter and engineer of the Duke. In practice, he did far more. Designed sets and costumes for court entertainments, devised hydraulic systems, planned architectural projects, painted portraits of Ludovico's mistresses, and spent years working on the great bronze horse that would never be completed. He was a multi-purpose genius, deployed wherever his talents were useful. The relationship between artist and patron in Renaissance Italy was never simple. Patronage enabled art. It also constrained it. Leonardo depended on Ludovico for income, workshop space, and social position. Ludovico depended on Leonardo to enhance his prestige, execute his commissions, and solve his practical problems. Each needed the other, but the power was unequal. When Ludovico wanted Leonardo to design a party, Leonardo designed a party. When Ludovico wanted Leonardo to paint his mistress, Leonardo painted her. The artist served the patron's agenda, however much he might also pursue his own. Leonardo seems to have navigated this dynamic with a combination of charm, unreliability, and strategic compliance. He was liked at court, praised for his beauty, his conversation, his musical abilities. He was also often late, often distracted, often failing to complete what he had promised. Ludovico tolerated this because Leonardo was worth the trouble. The things Leonardo did finish were extraordinary enough to justify the things he abandoned. The Sforza horse that never was. The great project of Leonardo's Milan years was the Sforza horse, a monumental bronze equestrian statue honouring Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza, the founder of the dynasty. Leonardo spent 12 years on it. He studied horses obsessively, measuring their proportions, sketching their movements, designing a figure that would surpass any equestrian statue ever made. The horse alone was to be over 23 feet high. To cast it would require approximately 75 tons of bronze. In 1493, Leonardo completed a full-scale clay model and put it on public display. Visitors were astonished. Nothing like it had been seen since antiquity. The horse seemed poised to move, captured in a moment of frozen power. Preparations began for the casting, one of the most ambitious bronze pourings ever attempted. Leonardo developed new techniques for the furnaces and moulds. The project seemed on the verge of realization. And then history intervened. In 1494, France invaded Italy. Ludovico needed cannons, not sculptures. The bronze that had been set aside for the horse was melted down and cast into weapons. The project was suspended indefinitely. When the French finally conquered Milan in 1499, their soldiers used the clay model for target practice, reducing it to rubble. Leonardo's greatest sculpture became his greatest loss, years of work destroyed by geopolitics. He never attempted anything similar again. In his notebooks from later years there are references to the horse, suggestions that he still dreamed of casting it, but the opportunity never returned. The clay that had awed Milan became mud. The bronze became cannons. The vision remained only in his drawings. This is perhaps the hardest kind of artistic loss, not the work that was never begun, but the work that was nearly complete, that existed in the world, that was seen and praised and then destroyed. Leonardo experienced this more than once. The Battle of Anghiari would be painted over, the Last Supper would crumble, but the Sforza horse was different. It was not decay or revision, but violence, the world deciding that war was more important than art. Leonardo, who had offered himself to Ludovico as a military engineer, understood this calculation. He had contributed to it. The cannons made from his bronze may have killed people. The horse would have killed no one. History chose cannons. Mini-documentary. Salai, the Devil in the Studio. In 1490, a 10-year-old boy named Gian Giacomo Caprotti joined Leonardo's household in Milan. Leonardo nicknamed him Salai, Little Devil, and kept him for the next 25 years, through every relocation, every upheaval, every change in Leonardo's circumstances. The relationship between them remains one of the most discussed and least understood aspects of Leonardo's personal life. Leonardo's own description of Salai is unflattering. Within the first year, he recorded in his notebooks that the boy was a thief, a liar, obstinate, and a glutton. He catalogued Salai's offences in detail: stolen money, stolen food, broken objects, lies. And yet he did not dismiss him. He continued to feed, clothe, and educate the boy. He paid for elaborate costumes. He made him an assistant, and eventually a companion who travelled everywhere with him. What was the nature of their relationship? Scholars have debated this for generations. In Renaissance Italy, the boundaries between master and servant, teacher and student, patron and dependent, were permeable in ways that do not map neatly onto modern categories. Some historians believe Leonardo and Salai were lovers. A 16th century writer explicitly claimed as much, and Leonardo's sexuality has long been a subject of speculation. Others see the relationship as paternal, a childless man adopting a surrogate son. Still others suggest a complex mixture of affection, dependence, exploitation, and habit that resists simple classification. What is clear is that Salai mattered to Leonardo. He appears in drawings throughout Leonardo's career, possibly as the model for several paintings. Leonardo left him a house and a substantial sum of money in his will. Whatever frustrations the little devil caused, Leonardo chose to keep him close for a quarter century. In an age before psychology, before modern categories of sexuality, before the vocabulary we now use to describe human attachment, Leonardo and Salai shared their lives. That is documented fact. Everything else is interpretation. Rome, rivals, and the loneliness of being Leonardo. In 1513, Leonardo travelled to Rome. He was 61 years old, and Rome was newly exciting. Pope Leo V the Medici was spending lavishly on art and architecture, and the city was filled with ambitious projects and ambitious artists. Michelangelo was there, having recently completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Raphael was there, painting the Vatican apartments. Leonardo, the elder statesman of the Renaissance, arrived to find himself sidelined. The Pope gave him lodgings and a stipend, but no major commissions. While Michelangelo sculpted and Raphael painted, Leonardo was relegated to minor projects dissecting corpses in the hospital of Santo Spirito, experimenting with varnishes, designing a parabolic mirror. Vasari later wrote that the Pope was exasperated with Leonardo's endless experimentation. Alas, this man will never get anything done, for he is thinking about the end before he has made a beginning. The criticism stung, but it also missed the point. Leonardo was not merely procrastinating. He was working on problems that interested him more than decorating churches. His anatomical studies continued. His investigations into geology, optics, and mechanics continued. He was, in his own terms, enormously productive, but his productivity did not result in the kind of finished, public works that made reputations and pleased patrons. Rome was a young man's game. Michelangelo was 38, Raphael was 30. They had energy, ambition, the political savvy to navigate papal politics. Leonardo had spent decades building a reputation that now seemed almost irrelevant. The world he had helped create had moved on. The techniques he had pioneered were now commonplace. The questions he had raised were being answered by others or being set aside in favour of different questions. He was a legend and an afterthought simultaneously. Rome would not become his city. By 1516, he had left for France, the French twilight. Francis I was 21 years old when he became King of France, a young man intoxicated with Italian culture and eager to import it across the Alps. He invited Leonardo to his court, offered him a manor house at Clos-Lucé near the royal chateau of Amboise, provided a generous pension, and asked for only one thing in return: Leonardo's presence and conversation. This was something new. For the first time in his life, Leonardo was valued not for what he could produce, but for who he was. Francis visited him regularly, walked through a tunnel connecting the chateau to Clos-Lucé to sit at Leonardo's feet, listened to him discourse on painting, philosophy, and the nature of the world. The king called him father and treated him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the very old or the very holy. Leonardo was 64 when he arrived in France, and his health was failing. A paralytic stroke had weakened his right hand, though not his left, which he used for writing and to some extent for drawing. He brought with him the Mona Lisa, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and his notebooks. He continued to work on these, continued to make observations, continued to design, but the urgency was gone. He was no longer racing to complete commissions or prove himself to sceptical patrons. He was simply living out his days in something like peace. He died on the 2nd of May 1519, at the age of 67. Vasari wrote that Francis was at his bedside, cradling Leonardo's head as he expired. This is probably legendary. Records suggest the king was elsewhere that day, but the image persists because it captures something true about Leonardo's final years. For once, genius was valued without being exploited. The old man who had spent his life serving dukes and popes ended in the care of a king who wanted nothing from him but his company. It was, perhaps, the kindest fate that could have befallen him. Mini-documentary. The Lost Battle Anghiari and the Limits of Genius. In 1503, the Florentine government conceived an extraordinary project. Two of the greatest artists in Italy, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti, would paint opposing walls of the great council hall in the Palazzo Vecchio. It would be a competition, a spectacle, a statement about Florence's cultural supremacy. Leonardo was assigned the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory from 1440. Michelangelo would paint the Battle of Cassina, another Florentine triumph. The two masters would work side by side, their rival visions confronting each other across the vast room. Leonardo began his preparations carefully, as he always did. He studied horses in motion, soldiers fighting, the chaos and fury of battle. He designed a central scene of tremendous violence. horsemen struggling for a standard, faces contorted with rage, swords swinging, horses rearing and biting. Contemporary witnesses describe the cartoon, the full-scale preparatory drawing, as terrifying in its intensity. Then he began to paint, and the painting failed. Leonardo was experimenting again, using an encaustic technique adapted from ancient Roman sources, in which wax-based paint was fused to the wall with heat. The process did not work as planned. The colours did not set properly. Parts of the painting began to drip. Leonardo tried to accelerate the drying with braziers of hot coals, but this only made things worse. The project stalled. Michelangelo, meanwhile, never got past his cartoon. He was summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II to work on what would become the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. Neither battle scene was ever completed. Leonardo's failed attempt was eventually painted over by Vasari, who may have preserved fragments of it beneath his own work. The lost Battle of Anghiari became one of art history's great mysteries, a masterpiece glimpsed by few, known mainly through copies and descriptions, hidden or destroyed behind later layers of paint. Mini-documentary, Codex Leicester, The Water Obsession. In 1994, Bill Gates paid $30.8 million at auction for a 72-page notebook written by Leonardo da Vinci around 1508. It is called the Codex Leicester, after the English earl who owned it for 3 centuries, and it is the only major Leonardo manuscript in private hands. Gates has since made it available for public exhibition and digitization, allowing scholars and enthusiasts to study pages they might never otherwise see. The Codex Leicester is not, strictly speaking, about any single subject. Leonardo rarely organized his thoughts that way. But water dominates the notebook, the properties of water, the behavior of water, the history of water on Earth. Leonardo asked why fossils of sea creatures were found on mountaintops, and concluded that the mountains had once been underwater, that the Earth's geography had changed over vast stretches of time. He studied the moon and proposed that its glow came from sunlight reflected off earthly oceans. He analysed currents, tides, erosion, the way rivers carved valleys and deposited sediment. Reading the Codex Leicester is like watching a mind work in real time. Leonardo moves from observation to hypothesis to doubt to new observation. He contradicts himself, reconsiders, starts again. The handwriting is dense and difficult. The diagrams are intricate. The ideas are simultaneously ancient, rooted in questions that go back to the Greeks, and startlingly modern in their approach to evidence and analysis. What does it mean that the private notebook of a 15th century artist now belongs to a 21st century technology billionaire? There is something appropriate about it, perhaps. Leonardo would have understood Gates, a man who built systems, who solved problems, who believed in the power of knowledge to transform the world. The Codex Leicester links 2 minds separated by 5 centuries, both obsessed with understanding how things work. It is a message in a bottle, written in mirror script, waiting to be decoded by whoever has the patience and resources to receive it. The myth machine. Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519. The myth of Leonardo began almost immediately. Giorgio Vasari, in his Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, published in 1550 and revised in 1568, established the template that would shape Leonardo's reputation for centuries. Vasari's Leonardo is a divine figure, effortlessly talented, gracious in manner, beautiful in person, the embodiment of artistic genius. He began the cult of the artist as superhuman that would become a cornerstone of Western culture. Vasari's account is not entirely reliable. He was writing decades after Leonardo's death, working from second-hand sources, shaping his narrative to serve his larger argument about the progress of Italian art. Many of his anecdotes are probably exaggerated or invented. The story of Verrocchio putting down his brush, the story of Francis I cradling the dying Leonardo. These are dramatic scenes that may have little basis in fact. But they became the facts that people remembered. Later centuries added their own layers to the myth. The Romantics made Leonardo a prophet of imagination, a rebel against convention. The Victorians made him a prototype of the scientist-artist, the universal man. The 20th century made him a brand. His face and his work reproduced on everything from mouse pads to cryptocurrency. His name invoked to sell cars and computers. his image shorthand for genius itself. Beneath the myth is a more complicated figure, a man who struggled with commissions, who was accused of heresy, who designed weapons of war while privately condemning violence, who left most of his work unfinished and much of it unpublished, who spent years in obscurity and died in a foreign country. The real Leonardo is not diminished by these complications, he is enlarged by them. The myth gives us a god, the reality gives us something more useful, a human being who pursued knowledge with extraordinary dedication and ordinary frailty, the curiosity that survives. Why does Leonardo still matter? Not just as a historical figure, not just as a source of famous images, but as a model for how to live and think. Part of the answer is the notebooks. We have, in those 7,000 surviving pages, the most detailed record of any Renaissance mind at work. We can see how Leonardo actually thought not the polished conclusions, but the messy process, the false starts, the tangents, the corrections. The notebooks are a permission slip for curiosity, a demonstration that questions are as valuable as answers, that the pursuit itself is the point. Part of the answer is the method. Leonardo embodied a way of approaching the world that cuts across our modern specializations. He did not recognize the boundaries between art and science, between observation and imagination, between theory and practice. He was simultaneously a painter, an anatomist, an engineer, a geologist, a musician, a philosopher. In an age that tends to reward narrow expertise, his example reminds us that the deepest understanding often comes from making unexpected connections. And part of the answer is the temperament. Leonardo was not a quick thinker. He was a slow one, endlessly patient, endlessly willing to look again, endlessly resistant to premature conclusions. Saper vedere. Knowing how to see required time, attention, and the willingness to admit uncertainty. These are not traits our culture especially values. We like speed, confidence, productivity. Leonardo offers a different model: depth over breadth, quality over quantity, understanding over completion. The world he lived in was smaller than ours, fewer people, less information, slower communication, but his approach scales. The problems we face, environmental, technological, social, are complex systems that resist simple solutions. They require the kind of patient, interdisciplinary attention Leonardo practiced. They require people willing to look closely at things others overlook, to ask questions that seem naive, to follow their curiosity wherever it leads. Closing. The question that remains. Leonardo left behind thousands of pages of questions. How do birds fly? Why is the sky blue? What makes water swirl in eddies? Where does the soul reside? His notebooks are filled with inquiries he could not answer, problems he could not solve, mysteries he could only gesture toward. He also left behind unfinished paintings, abandoned sculptures, designs for machines that could not be built. The adoration of the Magi waits eternally for completion. The Sforza horse was destroyed before it was cast. The Battle of Anghiari survives only in copies and fragments. In conventional terms, this might look like failure, a brilliant man who could not finish what he started. But I want to suggest another reading. Perhaps Leonardo understood something we tend to forget, that the most profound work is often the question, not the answer. His unfinished canvases, his impossible machines, his endless notebooks are not evidence of failure, but of a particular kind of honesty. He did not pretend to have answers he did not possess. He pursued understanding as far as understanding could be pursued, and when it ran out he stopped, or he moved on to another question, or he kept looking, adding layers of glaze to a portrait, hoping to capture something that words and paint could only approach. We live in an age that worships completion, finished products, measurable outcomes, problems solved and monetized. Leonardo offers a different vision, a life dedicated to the pursuit of understanding, with no expectation that understanding would ever be fully achieved. The universe revealed itself only to those patient enough to watch. He was patient, he watched. He filled his notebooks with what he saw. And now those notebooks sit in libraries and museums around the world, written in mirror script, waiting for readers willing to hold up a glass and decipher them. They are invitations, not conclusions. They are questions addressed to whoever comes next. They are, in their unfinished way, the most complete record we have of what it means to be curious. Leonardo died on a spring day in 1519 in a manor house in France, surrounded by the paintings he had carried with him for years. The Mona Lisa was there, still not delivered, still not done. The notebooks were there, thousands of pages he had accumulated over decades. His faithful companion Francesco Melzi was there, the young man who would inherit the papers and spend the rest of his life trying to organize them. What was he thinking at the end? We cannot know. But I like to imagine he was still looking, still noticing, still asking questions about the light falling through the window or the sound of the wind outside. The curiosity that defined him would not have stopped just because his body was failing. It was who he was, not a finished masterpiece, but an endless investigation, a method of being alive, a demonstration that the universe rewards those who pay attention. The notebooks remain, the questions remain, the invitation stands open. Dim the lights a little further, turn off the distractions, and look,